The United States debt is spiraling out of control, and it's not just me saying this. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has had to declare a financial war to save the government's finances. And you might be wondering, a war against whom? Against the bond watchdogs. Even though their name sounds like gunslingers straight out of the Wild West, they're actually the financial institutions that lend money to the United States government. Lately, the bond watchdogs haven't stopped demanding ever higher interest rates in exchange for their money. But of course, Bessent, seeing that this was a huge problem for his finances, decided to intervene in the market to lower rates. And how did he do that? Well, with the maturity swap trick. Take a look. A country's debt can be broadly divided into long-term and short-term debt. Generally speaking, long-term debt is more expensive, since investors face greater uncertainty the longer it takes to recoup their money. And short-term debt is the opposite. The current problem for Bessent and the watchdogs lies solely with long-term debt. It's the debt that's becoming the most expensive. So the secretary came up with an idea: take on more short-term debt to buy long-term debt himself. Basically, he told the watchdogs, "Won't you buy my debt at the interest rate I want?" Well then, starting in September, the government will do it, but we'll keep doing it until we get the interest rate where we want it. At its core, this is a way to manipulate the market, a tactic the government has actually been using since 2024, only now it intends to step on the gas by doubling its debt purchases. But pay attention to the detail. Starting in September. Why start in that month and not right now? Well, because Bessent doesn't actually want to have to buy more debt. What he wants is to set an expectation in the market to lower expectations. In other words, if the government announces that it's going to intervene to change interest rates, the market is expected to price in the lower rates the government wants to set in advance. In other words, the expectation alone is already capable of changing interest rates. And the truth is that this worked. The market took note, and the interest rate on 30-year debt, for example, the most expensive of all, plummeted suddenly. The problem? Well, just one day later, interest rates were right back where they had been. Bessent's grand strategy lasted 24 hours. The thing is, the markets believe Bessent is bluffing, that when September rolls around, he won't actually dare carry out his plan. After all, that would require a lot of short-term financing, or worse yet, the Treasury would have to use money from its cash reserves, and the US already has a massive deficit, so it's not as if it were an unlimited source of money. Not to mention that taking on massive short-term debt also means having to pay it back much sooner. And pay close attention, because this is where things get interesting. The upheaval hasn't been limited to debt alone.
Dollar buckles on Bessent's buyback, pound and euro rise. Bitcoin and gold surge as Bessent's bond market intervention weighs on the dollar.
Since the announcement, the dollar has fallen, gold has risen, Bitcoin has appreciated by more than 20%, and the euro has emerged stronger. In other words, three very different safe haven assets are rising at the same time. Three signs that US finances are at their limit. And clearly, all of this leaves us with three questions on the table. The first: if the United States is the world's greatest power, how is it possible that it lost a showdown with the market in just 24 hours? Second, what has the Treasury so desperate that it would resort to a move like this? And the third, if this is a US debt problem, why could it have such a significant impact on what happens in Europe, Japan, or even your own portfolio? Well, we're about to explain it all in this video. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some news for you. At Visual Factory, we've created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain in a clear and simple way the most essential investment concepts, what multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better, since we send each episode of the series by email, and every edition is unique. If you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them, and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into the video. The announcement of Besant's intervention in the debt market coincided with another highly symbolic moment. United States debt has broken through the $40 trillion barrier. Trillion with 12 zeros. That's 125% of the country's GDP. That's a lot of debt. Too much. And every second, another $90,000 is added. Spending on interest alone already exceeds defense spending. Or if you like, here's a more concrete example. The war in Iran is proving to be extremely costly, but all the money spent over these past 5 months of war is equal to the interest on the debt for just 12 days. I mean, it doesn't even cover 2 full weeks. This is due to 2 reasons. The debt is very high. And above all, the interest rates on that debt are also extremely high. The 30-year debt, for example, is the most expensive it has been since 2001. And that's precisely why Scott Bessent announced his plan to buy long-term debt. But what matters isn't the transaction itself, it's the message it sends to the market. The Treasury is going to do everything possible to lower the cost of long-term debt, and if you bet against us, you're going to lose money. And there's an anecdote that sums up the situation very well. They say that a banker who was a friend of JP Morgan, the most powerful banker of his time, was in the red, so he went to ask him for money. They met in the town square and walked to a restaurant to discuss whether he would grant him a loan. But when it came time to negotiate the loan, JP Morgan said his problem had already been solved. People had seen him walking with the most powerful banker in the world, so no one would dare bet against him. However, there's one small difference between this anecdote and Scott Bessent's: unorthodox operations. Everyone trusted the banker, but the Trump administration's credibility is in the gutter.
Bessent understands the problem, but understanding the problem and being able to do something substantial about it are 2 different things. The Treasury simply can't control long-term yields.
Donald Trump promised to lower the deficit to 3% at the start of his term, but he's done the exact opposite. His main economic proposal, the Big Beautiful Bill, cuts taxes without touching spending, which in fact continues to rise. The result? An additional $4 trillion in deficit over the next decade. And on top of that is his promise to spend another $1.5 trillion on defense. In short, the United States is addicted to debt, and on top of all this comes a new problem: the dollar. As you can see in the chart, the turmoil of the past few weeks has been bleeding it dry. Why? Well, here's the key to this whole issue. Remember that Bessent's plan involves short-term financing, right? On paper, short-term debt is cheaper than long-term debt, but it has one drawback. It's much more dependent on the interest rates set by the Federal Reserve. And if the Treasury keeps issuing shorter-term debt, the Fed is caught between a rock and a hard place. If it raises rates, the cost of debt skyrockets and the Treasury goes bankrupt. But if it keeps rates low, prices spiral out of control. And this works out great for the Treasury, because inflation eats away at the debt, but ordinary Americans don't like it when the cost of groceries keep going up. Do you see where this is all going? The dollar is falling because if Bessent carries out his plan, inflation is bound to skyrocket. But as if that weren't bad enough, a new problem is emerging. And no, we're not referring to the problems in Europe and Japan. We'll talk about those later. We're talking about the fact that the watchdogs are paying closer and closer attention. A decade ago, Washington could issue more debt, and nothing happened. Who bought that debt? Well, banks, institutional investors, other countries' central banks, and the Fed. All of those entities wanted to hold US debt, and in most cases, they are required by law to purchase these types of safe assets. So even if the quality of the debt deteriorates slightly, they won't demand higher interest rates as compensation. However, marketable debt has risen from $4 trillion in 2026 to $29 trillion this year. And of that extra $25 trillion, private households, neobanks, and other unconventional investors have snapped up $19 trillion. The point is that these people keep a much closer eye on US debt. If they believe a government is issuing too much debt without raising interest rates, they have no problem selling off their holdings and shifting to the stock market, fixed income, or anything else. This is where we enter the death spiral. The government increases the deficit, borrows to cover it, needs to attract debt buyers who will monitor it more closely, interest rates rise, public finances become unbalanced, and the cycle starts all over again. In any case, this is only half the story. The truth is that these problems aren't confined to the United States. Believe me, they're following this matter very closely in Europe.
My debt, your problem.
Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Japan, the interest rates they are paying on their debt are also through the roof at levels not seen in decades. In short, we're facing a global problem. It's not just a US issue. And why is all this happening? Well, partly because all countries have sky-high deficits and increasingly unstable policies. Because, naturally, if the country is fragmented and no one knows who's going to win the election, no politician will dare to implement fiscal austerity. But that's not the only factor. Ultimately, for a country to go into debt, someone has to lend to it, and it turns out that the number of lenders isn't infinite. We've already seen how the US has had to turn to increasingly demanding lenders because traditional banks can't absorb all the debt it has issued. And of course, every dollar they lend to Washington is a euro they don't lend in Europe.
High public debt in the United States is Europe's problem too. When the US issues more bonds and US government bond yields rise, German government bond yields tend to follow.
And the rest of the countries are left with only two options. Well, three, but the last one is a very special case that we'll discuss later. Either they improve their economies to reduce the risk of their debt, or they raise interest rates to compete with US debt. Since the former isn't going to happen, in practice, Trump's deficits are forcing France and Germany to pay more for their debt because they face more competition. What's more, in Europe, this problem comes with an added complication: the correlation between countries. Basically, lenders hardly distinguish between the debt of France, Italy, or Spain. For them, there is simply European debt, mainly because it's all backed by the European Central Bank, and if rates rise in one country, they rise in all of them. To put some numbers on the table, the correlation between 10-year bonds from France and Spain is 95%, and between France and Italy, 90%. The closer the correlation is to 100%, the more similar their debt is. On top of that, these percentages are rising. A decade ago, they were below 80%. However, the correlation between France and the United Kingdom is 70%, and with Canada or the United States, it drops to 60%. In other words, when a country in the Eurozone issues new debt, everyone pays the price. But do you know what's even worse? Countries aren't the only ones demanding more debt. AI also requires investments worth millions, and that is financed through debt. Lenders used to wonder why they should lend to Europe instead of the United States, but we could also add Google or Amazon to the equation. Again, 20 years ago, this wasn't a problem. On one hand, you had people investing in government debt, and on the other, those investing in the stock market. They didn't mix. But now investors, those who lend their money, are becoming increasingly demanding and scrutinize every detail to see which company or country offers the best terms. In conclusion, to tie this all together, the US deficit is spiraling out of control, and investors no longer trust the government, so they're demanding that Trump pay high interest rates on the debt, or else they won't lend him money. Besant's solution? Borrow in the short term to intervene in the long term. But in the end, he hasn't managed to lower long-term rates, and in return, he has indeed sown fear. Fear that the US will over-indebt itself with short-term debt to force the Fed to lower rates and thereby trigger inflation. That's why investors are seeking other safe haven assets like gold, Bitcoin, or even the euro. But this also affects other countries, because ultimately, the supply of loans is limited, and the more debt the US issues, the more expensively Europe, Japan, and Wall Street will have to borrow. And since Scott Bessant's plan has been a failure, what solution do we have left? Well, let's see. You all know that here on Visualeconomik, we don't like to be doomsayers. Here, we're on team nothing ever happens. However, we have to admit that the situation looks grim. Either AI will drive economic growth, or countries will reduce their deficits. And honestly, both outcomes are highly unlikely. In the end, all that's left is the third option we mentioned earlier: financial repression. A kind of silent adjustment that acts like a tax on households, but without them realizing it. For example, Europe is increasingly discussing capital controls, putting up barriers to make it harder to invest in the United States, so that Europeans are forced to lend to European companies and governments. And since there will be fewer people competing for our loans, they'll pay us a lower interest rate. In any case, we'll talk more about this topic in an upcoming video, but now it's your turn. Do you think the Bessant operation has achieved anything? Or is it like trying to put out a fire with a water gun? Does the Treasury really want to force the Fed to lower rates to finance itself, even if that triggers dollar inflation? And how do you think Europe should respond? You can leave your thoughts down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one.